Welcome. Be seated. Get food. But we're gonna commence. I'm Checker Finn with the Fordham Institute and the Hoover Institution. Welcome to a joint Fordham Hoover Walton Family Foundation event. We don't do it that complicatedly all that often, but we're delighted to be using Hoover's lovely new Washington space, in part because the Fordham event space is being renovated. But it's very nice to have this opportunity. Anyway, it's a double opportunity to co-host with my colleague Robert Pondiscio, Vice President and Senior Fellow at Fordham, and a former New York City school teacher in the Joel Klein era. We're here, obviously, to talk with Joel about his terrific book, copies of which, courtesy of the Walton Family Foundation, are available, one each, please, in the outer lobby. Take one with you, and if you run quickly enough to Joel at the end, maybe he'll sign it. He's got a plane or a train to catch back to New York, I know, this afternoon. I don't think Joel actually needs very much introduction. You've got a very short bio on the back. The opening pages of the book turn out to be a riveting autobiography in which I learned a great deal about Joel before he became chancellor in New York City. And you will too if you read the opening pages. More chapters to his life than I had ever known about or frankly even imagined. So he then graduated into being chancellor under Michael Bloomberg. Did I think, as impressive a job, maybe the most impressive job of any school superintendent, school chancellor in America, and has now escaped from the toils of the New York City Education Department into the toils of Rupert Murdoch. But we don't have to talk about that part today. We're delighted to have Joel here, and we agreed that we would start with questions from myself and Robert, and then we will open it up to the audience. Joel has now done this several times at least, talking about the book, and is a veteran of talking about the book. So let me kick off with a sort of obvious double-headed question, Joel. What are you proudest of and least proud of from your tenure as chancellor in New York City?
Well, first of all, thank you, Checker. Thank you, Robert. A couple of corrections right at the front end. You called it the Joel Klein era. In New York, we called it the Robert Pondiscio era. So when I was
one or two people called it the Bloomberg era, but we won't bother with that.
Exactly. And the other thing, I'll be happy to sign a few books afterward if you want to. I should just let you know that on eBay, they're worth a lot more unsigned than signed. But if you want yours signed, go for it. Let me say, I guess, you know, when people ask you the thing you're proudest of and the thing you're least proud of, I mean, I think that the chance to serve and to serve with so many good people who've gone on to so many different leadership positions, in some ways, I think it's the most enduring impact. It's not the thing that I was proudest of in terms of the work we've done, but in terms of you look around at whether it's commissionerships with Chris Cerf and other people, or district leadership, and you have people like J.C. Brizard, and you have Garth Harries and others, people that went on to do lots of nonprofits and so forth and so on. So the New York experience had long tentacles into the field of education, and I suspect in terms of its most enduring impacts, that's where it'll have its greatest input. In terms of what we accomplished in New York, and I'll be happy to unpack this for you, but I'm pretty sure the thing I'm proudest of is that the number of good schools, by some reasonable definition, increased significantly. That's not to say every school is a good school by the time we left, or there were no good schools when we started, but the actual number of good, high-functioning schools, and particularly in high-poverty communities, I think increased substantially. The thing I'm least proud of probably is that, and I've said this many times, and Robert and others have talked a lot about it, was the fact that I really didn't get the curriculum right until later on in my term. Early on, the curriculum we were using, I think, was not demanding and rigorous. I got a lot of help from Don Hirsch after several years, and I think we moved toward a core knowledge curriculum. But I wish I had gotten that a lot sooner. I think it would have much more impact. So those are just to open it up. There are a lot of other things, obviously, both in terms of things that I think worked and things that didn't work. But the measures that mattered to me most were those.
Thank you. as usual, I forgot about the Twitter. So what is it?
The hashtag is Klein Lessons. So
Klein
if you'd like to
Lessons.
ask a question on Twitter, just use hashtag Klein Lessons, and we'll see if we can get your question to Chancellor Klein.
And it will arrive at Robert's machine, not mine.
I would just point out, you do not tweet.
I don't.
This is, I mean, it's just.
I have enough bad habits.
I've been talking about the impact of tweeting at the age of 68, and I find it really exhilarating, I must say.
Well, you're young compared to me. I, as I said, I have enough bad habits, and my day's full enough. So no, not yet anyway. So what was the hardest part of it? I mean, of the job from the book, sounds like dealing with Randy and the teachers union, but you may have a completely different view of what was the hardest part of the job.
I think the hardest part is that when I was in my private sector practice of law, I represented the American Psychiatric Association, and during that era, I did a lot of public speaking, and you needed a joke to kick off the speech. And my favorite joke, there was a raft of light bulb jokes going around at that point. My favorite one was, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? The answer is only one, but the light bulb really has to want to change. And what I learned, the hardest thing about the system, which shocked me, was how resistant to change it was at every level, not just the unions, but the bureaucrats and the teachers. I think Ali Kimmel wrote in one of her blog posts, I mean, one of the successes of the book, she said, was it actually brings to life the oppressive nature of what it is to exist in a bureaucratic system that is utterly resistant to change. In the decade before Bloomberg became mayor, the graduation rate, four-year graduation rate under very low standards was somewhere around 45%. And if you say for a decade, you would have thought the system was so eager to think about how do we do things new and different, and how do we succeed, and how do we improve for the kids. But the resistance to change was enormous, and that was the thing that felt oppressive. People used to say, what did I dislike most about you being chancellor? And they'd often say, I suppose it was getting up and reading all those newspapers beating up on you. Not that I liked that, but the thing I disliked most was to be in an environment where really merit and innovation were so underplayed and yet so necessary and critical to the transformation of the system. So that to me was, and it was much broader in many ways than just the unions.
There's a little vignette in the book about, I think it was when you were still on Livingston Street before you moved to Tweed, about the phone blinking. They said to you something like, don't worry about it, it's only a parent. If you ignore it, it'll go away.
Exactly. I mean, I'll never forget that. It was the first day on the job. It was August 19, 2002. I've been gearing up for the job for about a month after the mayor announced me. And then somebody said that to me, and I thought, this has got to be from Central Casting. First of all, 110 Livingston Street had to be from Central Casting. It looked like they had imported the Kremlin right into Brooklyn. The thing was so bureaucratic in every sense. But there was a sense which you can't understand. One of the really important reasons I wrote this book, and I'd ask you to read it, is because I want people to feel what 8 years in a system in which the status quo is so pervasive, so smothering, and what that's like day in and day out in terms of trying to find ways to breathe. And in some respects, for my colleagues who are doing this work, I continue to think the heroes in this system, and there are many, but at the top of the list are really the people out in the field who are actually banging their heads against the wall trying to bring change to systems that so resist change. And emblematic for me were two stories that I tell in the book. One was literally at a hearing early on where the mayor talked a lot about patronage, and one of the assembly people said during the hearing, he said, this is ridiculous, everybody knows there's no patronage in the school system, so on and so forth. And at the end of the hearing, he takes me back and says to me, there's a principal for the Democratic Club in Brooklyn who is under scrutiny. If you could protect him, you'll have no trouble with us going forward. So, you can't even make this kind of stories up. And this story about the phone was just, I said, what do you mean that's a parent that they'll go away? They say, well, we get a lot of parents complain, and we don't have much answer for them. And they felt no obligation to find an answer for them. So it's a totally client-resistant culture. Now, if somebody big and powerful, if a politician calls, they hop to that. And one of the things that was really important, which anytime I spoke at Tweed, I always made the following point when I talked to some 500-600 people, many of whom pre-existed our arrival. And I would say, this is a system that runs on the principle that the greasy wheel gets, the noisy wheel gets the grease. And I said, to me, we should service everyone, but my heroes are the people who give voice to the voiceless. That kid in the Bronx who has no champion whatsoever, who's not going to get a politician to call us, that kid needs your work and your service. And trying to create that kind of culture was enormously complicated, but I actually think had some traction over the years we were there.
Let me push you on that a little bit if I can. One of the criticisms that has been leveled against you while you were chancellor, and you respond to this in the book, is that you, and I want to find the quote, that you should have been more strategic about how you engage parents, public, and others, and I think you quote Jim Liebman on this. So on the one hand, do you think that's a fair criticism? And if you should have done it differently, how would you have done it differently?
I think it is a fair criticism, and I think it's a criticism of the school reform movement. I think we're too happy sort of talking among ourselves in an echo chamber and feeling comfortable and right about our values. We haven't developed constituency, and I think that was critical, and I could have done a better job. And I like to say, no Jewish boy I know has ever spent more time in African-American churches than I did. I mean, it was just part of my routine, and I learned a lot. But it touches a small percentage of the people that we need to touch. And one of the things I should have done a better job from the beginning is getting people out in communities, building constituency, greater relationships with faith-based leaders and community leaders and so forth. But I separate that from the service-based, parent-focused culture of the organization. And the second thing, which I'm convinced has paid us the greatest long-term dividends, by creating 160 or so new charter schools under the mayor and some 500 new public schools, all schools of choice. We created parent constituency. I'm a big believer when people talk about parental involvement, getting parents involved really in choosing schools for their kids is one of the most empowering things we can do. So on the political front, the community relations front, fair claim. And equally true, not figuring out better ways to engage our teachers. That buying the notion that the prism through which you engage teachers is through the union. Now, there were legal restraints on us, but I'm convinced that there are a lot of teachers who believe what I believe, that the current system is not working well for teachers, just as it's not working well for students. And a profession that loses half its people in the first 5 years ought to be taking a very hard look. Imagine if we lost half our physicians, half our engineers, half our lawyers in the first 5 years. You think anybody wouldn't be saying there's something dreadfully wrong with this? How do we think about it? How do we change it?
So let me put Robert on the spot for just a second, since you were a teacher during this time. First of all, where were you a teacher and what were you teaching?
5th grade at PS 277, District 7 in the South Bronx.
So the real question is, did it feel any different?
Oh, absolutely.
How? How did it manifest
This is
itself?
actually something I was going to ask you about, because you had this, you get the sense from reading your book that you don't believe that there was a lot of movement. As a classroom teacher, I felt there was a lot of movement. Would it have been movement in a direction that we might have liked? That's a different question. But there was suddenly a sense, I would argue, and maybe Claire Sullivan, who was my teaching colleague back then, could also verify that her understanding is like mine. You got the sense that suddenly you had to sit up and take notice. People were paying attention. So your spine was stiffened, as it were. But did that improve the direction? Did it improve the quality of instruction? You had a sense of a heightened level of scrutiny.
From whom?
There was a sense of the bosses watching. Now, whether the boss is your AP, the principal, the local instructional supervisor, but there was a sense that you simply could not just go about business as usual. Again, it was a bit of an unguided missile, but there was a sense of that we were moving in a direction.
Were you a union member? I assume you were a dues payer.
I was a dues payer. I was not a union member.
So did the union at your school respond in any way?
The only thing the union at my school ever did was try to get me fired. Which,
well,
story
they don't believe in ineffective teachers. That union, right?
Well, I'm not going to claim to have been a particularly effective teacher.
I think there were two levels. One, I think Robert's right. There certainly the system felt impact. Some of it was caught up in some of the micromanagement, which I think in the book was overdone. And I think that
bulletin boards,
rugs,
right,
those kind of things.
Well, you know, a child can't learn to read unless he's
sitting on a rug. And if the mini lesson is more than 10 minutes, boy, that's going to destroy the kid's future.
Absolutely.
Sure. Right. So I think there was some of that, and that goes to the whole curriculum thing. The other thing I think does take a toll, particularly when you start to hold people accountable. I mean, one of the best things we did, and I write about it at length in the book, was really to trade off this bureaucratic micromanagement over time for a model of leadership, empowerment, accountability. and trying to bring sound organizational principles. So every principal in New York actually signed a performance agreement with us. Now, once they were on the hook, they were certainly out there making sure that you feel some of the pressure in the system. I'll never forget Jeff Canada once gave a speech before a whole bunch of people in New York. It was a little embarrassing, but it was funny. And he said, he said, when I opened up my charter school, the chancellor met with me and he said, look, Jeff, I love you, but I want you to do good stuff and we're going to hold you to account. And he said, and Klein said to me, in 5 years, if you're not doing really well, I'll close you down. He said, and I met with my staff and I told him the chancellor said in 5 years he's going to close us down if we're not doing well. And I told my staff, meaning Jeff, we're going to be the last one to go. So that kind of sense that there was accountability and responsibility, I do think reverberated around the system.
I gather that the mayor backed you on everything or most things, or how would you describe the mayor's political support in particular?
His political support was enormous. I mean, and he not only his support for me, but his willingness to take on the political fights. His view was I should focus on the school system. This was really different because before me, the chancellors were independent political players and had lots of political roles to fill. The mayor didn't want that. He really wanted me in a management function. But politically, and I tell this in the book, and it's a true story, every now and again the mayor would call you at about 6 in the morning. And if you're a chancellor, this is like he's not calling to say hello, good morning. I mean, he's got a day job. And so normally it would be, why did you mess this up, whatever. But every now and again he'd call me at 6 in the morning and say, I'm really furious. I said, oh, what do I do now? And he'd say, no, it's nothing you did. He said, Randy called for you to be fired. Now I can't fire you even if I want to. And so that was really, that's classic Bloomberg. But having your back is something anybody who's ever worked for Mike will say. It's not that he didn't chew you out afterward, but having your back publicly was something he was terrific at.
You had weekly meetings, the book says, or even more often sometimes, and you imply that sometimes he pushed back against ideas that you were promoting or going to try or initiatives you were going to undertake.
He would push back, although, by and large, he would let us run the department. He would push back, and sometimes there were things he felt very strongly about. Social promotion was one that he felt and pushed very hard on. Some of the things about weighted student funding, he had some pretty hard questions. How do you weight it? What are the values? I mean, you know about this because you've written a lot about it, but how do you figure out how different kids get different amounts of money in a cash system? What happens in a system like New York where you sort of have a zero-sum game? So you're moving money from some communities to other communities, the communities that are losing money, what are their reactions? So he would push back. But by and large, Mike's point, and it reflected in the way I ran the school system, this whole notion of empowerment and accountability for principals. Mike's basic view of the people he hires is he holds them accountable. And I must say, I felt that just like Robert felt it in the schools. I felt that from the mayor. I mean, when you'd come in with results that were not as good as you'd hoped they would be, it was, shall we say, not a fun meeting. I mean, I always thought accountability was a great idea until the mayor decided to apply it to me. It got to be a little tougher.
I gather he also, from a line in your book, he also looked pretty closely to see if your numbers added up.
Not only if they added up, but if they were being presented well. And he's got an instinct for numbers. And people always said, which I mentioned in the book, they said to me, what's it like to meet with Bloomberg? I said, well, it's always interesting because he's a very intelligent guy who's penetrating in his questioning and a very quick study. But the one thing, you better make sure your numbers are bulletproof. Because if they're not, boy, that's not a fun meeting. I mean, this is a guy who gets numbers.
There was a story in the paper this morning that, I'm not sure if you saw it in the New York Post, that some significant number of New York City teacher preparation programs are certifying literally zero of their students because they can't pass a literacy test. The numbers are fairly appalling. You write a lot in the book about teacher quality, and on the one hand, I agree with you that it's a significant issue. But you also write that there are limits to what you can do in turning around a school system like New York because of teacher quality and the ingrained habits. How much juice can you squeeze from teacher quality alone? You've written a lot about it, you've talked a lot about it, but you're recognizing there's limits.
Well, you've got a workforce that exists, and you've got to start with that. Now, trying to, as I talk a lot about the book, how do you re-engage them and so forth. But one of the things we did, and Wyckoff and others have written about, was through new hires And in a system that turns over as many people as one like New York, you can bring in a lot of friends, people like you who came, from other walks of life and so forth and so on. So I think you can do a lot here. I was just saying, we started with some close to 80,000 teachers. And so dealing with the realities of that and how you move forward. But this story in the Post, which I not only read, but I tweeted about this morning, was actually a very powerful story. Because think about this. This is a basic literacy test, which people are not passing. And in some of those schools, they had a pass rate of 10 or 12%. It's really shocking. One school had 0. So this is really going to, I think this is one of the coming issues. And I give NCTQ and others a lot of credit for this, for focusing on this issue of both who we're bringing into the profession and how we're training them. And both Al Shanker, who I quote in my book, and Sandy Feldman, who I quote in my book, both revered union leaders focus on these issues. So I think this kind of thing, I call for something like the equivalent of bar exam, so that ed schools that have got a 35% to 40% pass rate would eventually be sunset. But I think this has real leverage and real potential. And however long it takes, we should insist on doing more and more of it.
Fair enough, but in a country that needs 3.7 million full-time classroom teachers, are we going to find enough of those who can pass these?
If we pay people rationally, I think yes. I think we can. I was not worried about that in New York. In New York, when we really started focusing on teacher quality, we were getting a lot of applicants. Where we weren't getting enough applicants, and one of the things I've always complained about and how you do pay differentials. In math and science, just as a practical matter, we weren't getting the applicants we needed. So a lot of kids in communities where you were teaching were being taught math by very nice people who cared a lot about it, but never studied math. And so that was a particular problem. But I think the answer, look, if we stabilize teaching and do what Shanker said and make it a real profession, and people think it has the respect and the honor and all the other things that go with it, then I think we'll create a more stable teaching force, and that'll attract more people. The notion, which I just find, I know I've said it before, but I find mind-boggling, we lose half the profession in the first 5 years. That's just not a winning formula. Again, think about that if it was happening in medicine. The investment we're making, both as a system in terms of educating people and as a system in terms of bringing them in, and then they all leave.
There's actually a lot of Shanker in your book.
A lot of Shanker in my book. I read his work. One of the things that inspired me is the day I took the job, I started becoming, being a total outsider. I say in the book, most people thought that Joel Klein, the guy who writes for Time magazine, got the job. No. Why people find this funny, I don't know. But
it is.
It is.
But, that's why.
But he had written anonymous. What made him more qualified, I don't know. But I at least was out there. I wasn't anonymous. But in all seriousness, I just read everything I could get my hands on, including all of these old speeches and papers by Shanker. And there's so much in there that people would rather ignore today, that are so powerful. This thing called The Making of a Profession, which was written in 1985, is one of the best things I've ever read. And Shanker got it. He got the fact that if we don't go beyond collective bargaining to a true professionalism, that the long-term prospects are going to be diminished. And that's what we're seeing right now. There's no question about it.
Yep. You did put a great deal of your energy into principles and into reshaping the principalship, creating new terms of employment for principals, training principals, and so forth. Is this because that's a more efficient, because there are fewer of them, it's a more efficient strategy for changing a system? Is it because the principals union was not quite as intractable as the teachers union? What was the reason behind the strategy?
The main reason was because the unit that matters. This is the essence of my own thinking. This is why when people say you're for charter schools, to me, this is politics. I am for good schools. If I'm the parent of a kid, whether it's PS 11 or charter school 11, is a matter of indifference to me. Whether it's good or bad really matters. And that, to me, was the unit, right? So people want to talk about the school system. That's what the politicians and the unions and everybody. I wanted to talk about the individual school. We called it Children First, a system of great schools, not a great school system. And that was because everything that was about was where do you send your kid to get an education? You send her to a school, and if that's good, that matters. And that's why I said at the outset the thing that mattered most to me was a number of good schools. When we started at the top 25 in New York, none of them were from New York City, New York State. By the time we finished, more than half were from New York City, and that's just indicative.
Top schools in the state?
In the state.
Or none of them from New York City,
them,
okay.
And by the time we finished, more than half. So that became a big measure. Now, you can't have a good school without good school leadership. You know, whatever you think of Fordham, and I'm a fan of Fordham, don't agree with everything they do, but I'm a fan of them. Whatever you think of them, without Checker's leadership, it's a very different organization. It never would have matured into the organization. Leadership is the ineffable variable in any organization. And if we don't get that right, you can't navigate around it. Teachers like Robert don't want to work for a principal who doesn't know how to lead. And there was this deep belief in the system that somehow the principals became this political appointment of the superintendents, and that they were the people who played the political game. And my basic view of this thing was, no, we've got to find a different, you could be a great teacher, doesn't make you a great principal. And you can be a great principal and not necessarily have been a great teacher. And so finding the people who had the leadership skills, who understood, how do you support teachers, right? To me, one great principal could do a whole hell of a lot more to attract and support, particularly with all the new schools we're opening, great teachers. So that's why I focus on that particular part of it. I still think it's the undervalued piece of the system, and part of that is because of the politics of the system. I always used to say the weakest link in the organizational chain was the principal. Top down from the bureaucracy, right? Pulling on them like a little puppet. You know, do this. When I got there, the principals used to have their assistant principals picked by the superintendents. I mean, I thought it was the nuttiest damn thing I'd ever heard, right? You've got to be able to assemble your team. So I decided I would change it. So I remember I had 40 superintendents then. I met in a room with 40 of them, in a room like this. And they said, oh, Chancellor, you can't do that. I said, what are you talking about? I said, why can't I have the principals pick the assistant principals? Mind you, these are all principals these people picked. They select them. They said, well, you can't do that because they don't know how to pick an assistant principal. So you're smiling. So I said, if we've got principals that don't know how to pick an assistant principal, how the hell is this going to work? We've got to start all over again. This makes no sense. If you don't know how to assemble your team, it is game over day one. And if you allow other people to assemble your team, then I know that you're not really responsible, because then you're just going through the motions. So we change that. But I do think this whole role of effective leadership, and leadership is not dictatorship, but leadership really makes people want to come to work, get behind it. In the several hundred new small schools, high schools, which is one of the things we did that has now been demonstrated by lots of measures to work. But in that, we had principals who could select teachers who were bringing in people who were really terrific and building teams and understanding the way. And I'm convinced that that's one of the reasons why that new small school initiative worked.
One of the other changes you got through was letting principals at least reject teachers they didn't want to have in their school.
Huge. To this day, principals in New York will tell you, one of the most important things we did is to say, at least you may not be able to fire people, but you don't have to hire people. And it costs us a ton of money. But imagine this, when I started, just think about this, people would get excess. Hi, Nina.
Hi, Nina. There's seats up front.
It's the price you pay for showing up late. You get called out personally. But I'm sure you were doing very important work, so thank you for joining us. But no, I thought, and this was, there's no question, one of the biggest contractual changes. At that point, and most of you are familiar with this, I found it shocking that teachers who could be excess to the school, and you usually didn't excess teachers who were high performing, could show up in another school and say, I have seniority at Robert's school, I want the next spot. And even if somebody had been hired, they could bump them, literally bump them out. And I said, you can't interview them, nothing. And now, how nutty is this? And so one of the things we really went to the mat on, and Bloomberg backed us with a lot of political pressure, is saying that principals could at least select the people on their staff. And I'll tell you, this whole thing, which is euphemistically referred to as the dance of the lemons, this whole thing works to the disadvantage of minority kids. Of the shocking moments I've ever seen is 3 principals on the Upper East Side, all middle-class schools, meet with me in my second year before we made this change. And they say to me, I said, what's the worst thing we did at Tweed? And I thought they were going to say, well, this thing with the rugs or the bulletin board, I don't know. You know, so I thought, no, because by then I had kind of lost interest in the rugs. So they meet with me. They say, well, you sent us teachers who were excess in another school to work at our school. And I said, yeah, because I told everybody if this rule is in effect, we got to do this equitably. And they said, no, don't be ridiculous. Our community would never accept them.
We live on the Upper East Side.
We live on the Upper East Side. So I said to them, well, what should I do with those teachers? They said, well, that's your problem. See, no, but it's not my problem. That's a problem of the kids who go to his schools. Because that's what, when he's got 15 or 20 vacancies at his school or in central Brooklyn, they just put these people there, right? And that's the way the system works. So that when the music stopped, everybody had a chair. And if it was too bad for the kids, it was too bad for the kids. Now, that's a shocking thing. And to me, this became the firepower of my equity concern, which was all of a sudden what I saw was this acronym I created called OPCs, right? So other people's children, usually people in high poverty communities, often communities of color, they're told that teachers who can't teach on the Upper East Side should go to those schools. And think about it, in most of those schools, they'd have 18, 20, sometimes more teachers turnover every year. If we had a vacancy on the Upper East Side, there would be 500 teachers apply for it. Where's the equity remotely in any of that? So one of the things that I at least said is when we do this business with excess teachers, let's do it fairly. And that began to put some pressure on the system. And so the answer is, of the things that endure, and if you talk to principals in New York, the ability to hire your own people and not force place people is really important. On the other hand, right now New York's got about $100 million of these people who are not forced placed, who have no position, and the system keeps paying for them. Sensible rule on that was you get a year. If you don't find another position, then you move out of the system. But it's very hard to move people out of the system.
What, are you saying that rule, the one-year rule, is no longer in effect?
It never was in effect.
Was never
we tried to get a one-year rule, and that was the thing we lost in the arbitration. But I thought it was better to say you can't force a person on a school, even if it meant paying them fundamentally for being a substitute or whatever, than it was to force them on a school.
Let's see if we can make a little bit of news here. And send your questions if you're following online to hashtag Klein Lessons.
Before you make news, I wanted to ask another question about money.
Let's talk about
money always makes news.
Joel just mentioned about a sort of waste of $100 million, and earlier you had made reference to a zero-sum game. But in reality, you had a lot more money in the system at the end of your time there than you did at the beginning, didn't you?
A lot of money. Most all of it went to teacher raises.
Yeah.
I mean, Bloomberg gave the teachers a 43% raise. So the amount of money in the system over the course of the 8 years that I was there is a lot. But there's an example where if you could use the money more intelligently, you could get a bigger bang for the buck. Now, having said that, moving starting salaries from $30,000 to $45,000
makes a big difference.
Makes a big difference.
Okay. Okay.
Late in the book, and this is a quote, you say that Mayor de Blasio will be able to roll back some important reforms and, in my view, do some real damage. And I kind of wanted you to say, what? What real damage do you expect?
So it's hard to know, but certainly I thought when you eliminate the letter grades on the schools, that's a signaling impact that I thought was important. He was going to try to push back some of the charter things. So I think there are things he can do. But the point I make at that point, and one of the things people who operate systems understand, which is hard to understand sometimes on the outside, systems survive because they have constituency. Status quo has its protectors. Somebody once said to me, the school reform movement would do well to read Machiavelli and understand him. And we didn't, which is changing from a status quo that has protectors to an unknown future that you're trying to say to people, this will be good. The people who don't benefit from that unknown future, hard to mobilize, and the people who think they're going to get hurt from losing the past are going to fight like hell against you. So that's the dynamic that Machiavelli brilliantly points out. And so for us, what I was saying in that thing is I'm sure they will change some things, and that's unfortunate from my point of view. However, what they run into is a new status quo with new defenders. So when they tried, for example, to shut down a charter school, the politics of that turned against them like that. And that, I think, is what happens when you create new status quos. Those 600 or so new schools we opened now have constituency that will fight for them in a way that will be very hard to undo them. So there are changes that they can make and things they'll do differently. But look, they got elected. They're entitled to do things differently. And some of the things they're doing pre-K, I think, are really stuff in the right direction.
Okay. Have you had a conversation with your successor, Carmen Farina?
I never talk about my conversation with government officials because most people who talk to me rather do it confidentially, so I leave it at that.
I'll take that as a yes.
I wouldn't do that. I would take it as what I said it was.
The constituency aspect certainly did mobilize in the case of charter schools, thanks in no small part to Eva Moskowitz's astonishing capacity to mobilize.
Something in the way she moves.
Something. But other things that are reforms worth having don't get constituencies. Letter grading of schools doesn't get a constituency, does it?
Not enough. You get some parents kind of like it, or but they're not the kind of thing you can mobilize. The new small high schools have constituency because you have kids attending them.
Right.
If you tried to shut down those that were high performing and reaggregate them in a big congregate care, they would develop constituency. But look, constituency comes about from things that really impact your kid and his life. And things like letter grades or the role of superintendents. I mean, it's much too diverse and amorphous for people out there. That's why I said before, one of the great failings, in my view, of the school reform movement is we don't spend the time really doing the organizing and the work of developing constituency, and we need to do much more of that.
But I think your point, Machiavelli's point, if you will, that people who do not yet benefit from something have trouble visualizing how they might benefit from it, whereas those that see themselves losing something from that change can picture it immediately.
Well, that's why, for example, it's very hard to undo that forced placement rule in New York.
Yeah.
Because the principals, I think, really feel strongly about that, and they would push back in a big way.
If they lost that right to today.
And the unions never liked that rule. I mean, we created a whole group of people called ATRs, which are like substitute teachers, getting full pay, and they don't like it because they get moved from school to school and stuff like that.
Oh.
So they pushed back. They created their own subchapter in the union recently, and they pushed back. But my submission is that's going to be a virtually impossible rule to roll back.
So this one's incredibly wonky, but it goes to the question of rolling back. When I visited you one time at Tweed, one of the things you were most proud of was the new data system. I believe Liebman had created it. Now it sounds like it's being set aside by the new team. Data systems, of course, will almost never have a constituency except at think tanks, and maybe a few people in the central office. But was the data system? I mean, it was important to you. Why is it not important to the world to keep and have and use?
Well, what they said when they shut down this one was they were going to replace it with another one. So it's not like they're walking away from data systems.
Okay.
But I think, by and large, again, I don't mean to say it's wonky, but it's a little diffuse. When I was there, I talked to lots and lots of teachers who thought the data were helpful to them. So it depends to me on what they replace it with, whether this is a serious erosion or not. And the parents, when I was there, and the last year I was there, I think there were out of 1 million parents, 300,000 who were using this data system, which seems to me to be a significant number. So I think there is some value to it. But those are not I mean, it'd be very hard to say to people, we got to, take over the Bastille over a data system. I mean, it just seems unlikely.
That's what I was thinking. It doesn't get a constituency.
No, that's why things like don't take away my charter school gets constituency, because that I know is going to impact Juan. Yeah. It's going to impact Juan. Now I'm interested. But data systems, superintendencies, all of that just seems to people way too remote. That's what both gives you the ability to try to run ahead of the field. One of the things someone once said about me was, being an outsider, I didn't know all the things that I wasn't supposed to do, so I just did them. And a lot of times, as the mayor used to say, it's better to ask for forgiveness than for permission.
Right.
We just say, oh my gosh, I don't know. But, you change the status quo. You create new constituencies.
So on balance, are you in favor of mayoral control of large urban school systems?
I'm not even on balance. I'm unequivocally in favor of it. Doesn't mean that it'll. So you don't agree with me. Doesn't mean that not you. Somebody in the front row who's.
Well, we get ordinary people at these events. It's okay.
Sometimes on the stage, but I think schools, to me, with some rare exceptions, school boards tend to be more cautious, less willing, and they don't have the political stroke to do the big things like a Bloomberg did. Now, the problem with that is, of course, the next mayor can do big things in the other direction, and I respect that. But that seems to me to be inherent in the democratic system. On the other hand, I would like a mayor who's accountable to the whole city, highly visible, controls the purse strings, to be accountable for the school system, even if she's doing things that I don't always agree with. And I think it's interesting, and I would say one of the great developments is in the course of my career in education is the role of urban mayors, particularly Democratic urban mayors, who have all, not every mayor, but many of them have begun to move on school reform because they see the impact for their kids in their cities. And so when you look at guys like Antonio Villaraigosa, or you look at Adrian Fenty in this city, Mike Bloomberg, look what happened up in Boston, those are where I see a lot of foment for change, and that to me is a good thing. So I'm a big mayoral control person.
Okay. I've got one more question. You may have more, and then we'll open it up.
Absolutely.
This is my only sort of ad hominem question, caddy ad hominem question. Are you still pleased that you linked up for a while with Al Sharpton?
Look, the thing I did with Sharpton, I didn't work out as I had hoped it worked out, but there was nothing about it other than to try to develop more constituency, get leadership in the minority community to get involved in school reform. And when we were involved, he was out there on principles that really mattered. And so in that respect, there was nothing about my experience that wasn't a good one.
I'm looking through Twitter trying to find a question. I'm not finding questions, but I'm finding an awful lot of, how can I put this, strong opinions about our guest. So let me make a question.
That means lots of people are listening.
Are they quotable in polite company?
No, of course not. Can one ever develop a thick enough skin to abide that day after day for 8 or 9 years?
I mean, that's a great question. It's not fun. And anybody who thinks it's a good thing to have people pummel you is wrong about that. On the other hand, I never took it in a really personal sense, in the sense that I wasn't doing this job for me.
Well, you're using the past tense. It's still going on.
Yeah, no, it's no more fun now than it used to be, if that's what you're asking me. I mean, it's not something I'm looking to do. But, no, you take a lot of pounding. But I've always said to people, in life you have choices, whether if you want to be consequential, you're often going to be controversial. And I think that's to be expected. I try not to take the thing personally. And I always said to people, this isn't about Joel Klein. I mean, Joel Klein got a great education in New York City public schools, and I will be fine. But the kids in New York, many of whom in high poverty communities right now are massively underprepared for what they need in the 21st century. That's where I'd like the focus to be. And if we can keep the focus on that, then I think we can make some progress. The more people want to make it ad hominem and personal and so forth, it feels good, but I don't think it has any real value.
Let me take a couple of questions. And we have microphones? Yes, we do. And do us the kindness of identifying yourself before you ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Charlie Cobb, formerly a protege of Checkers and with the Committee for Economic Development. One question. Joel, you cited with some obvious fondness Al Schenker. And I remember almost 25 years ago, he was on the first President Bush's Education Policy Advisory Committee.
PPAC.
PPAC, as it was called, Checker, exactly. So my question is, that was 25 years ago. Why is the pace of change in education so damn slow? And if you look at the results of the PISA reports from the OECD, you see countries with far smaller gross domestic products than the United States leapfrogging us. So what can pick up the pace? I mean, it's outrageous.
Look, I agree with you. I think, why are things moving so slowly? Because I think basically the status quo is dug in. And I think there's this phenomenon, which I want to pivot to in a second because of the Common Core. But I think this used to be seen as a problem of OPCs, other people's children. My kids in middle-class neighborhood, they're going to do fine. I don't have to worry about it. If this is a problem for high-poverty neighborhoods. I always said think about the difference between terrorism and education. Terrorism doesn't know zip code. When it strikes, if anything, it's more likely to strike in a neighborhood where people are randomly available from any class of life. Whereas zip code is what defines what we've gone on in education, and so those are, quote, OPCs. Now, one of the things that Common Core and the new set of testing and so forth is doing is having people realize that this is not just other people's children, but we got a much broader problem. And PISA has pointed this out for years. But, parents don't know what PISA means for their kid. So they don't, it's not a, it goes back to what Checker and I have been talking about. So I think the more people start to realize that we're being outperformed by Vietnam and Poland and other places, and not just our kids from poverty areas, but across the board, I think the more we're going to see a building consensus. But make no mistake about it, most people look at education as a divisible governmental service. And those people who are middle class are able to either get the school they want, move to the community they want, or opt out through private schools. So it's hard to get them all ginned up for the kind of commitment and reform. Now, what I say in the book, in the last paragraph, and the thing I feel most strongly about, is that people don't realize that OPCs, other people's children, are our children. And the future of this nation depends on creating opportunities for those people. We're going to pay a massive price. It's no longer viable to think that a kid who graduates high school or worse drops out of high school is going to be able to find a job in the 21st century economy. When I started school in New York City, and you know this from your research, when I started school in 1951 in New York City, 60% of our workforce were high school dropouts. That number is now fewer than 6%. So we've got a very different educational hill to climb.
You do make mention in the book of a series of parties in Central Park West where you were trying to get the hedge fund elite interested in the fate of the school system. Did
it's
you?
A little pejorative in that you say hedge fund. There's other elites live on the Fifth Avenue. I mean, but
okay.
Yeah, but you're right. No, I did that to build political constituency because those people I was trying to convince that this other people's children's future really will impact the city, and I think I did have success in that.
Okay. Oh, Mike.
Thanks. It's Will Marshall, Progressive Policy Institute. And Joel, thanks for taking the pummeling. That was a great inspiration to those of us who have been working in the school reform vineyards for a long time. And I was at the time a charter school authorizer in Washington, and we were quite inspired. But the one question for you is, can we make a lot of progress without having a fundamental change in the way school boards operate? Because in D.C. we made a lot of progress in part because we had a charter school board implanted here by Congress. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had the progress had that not been the case. You talked about mayors and reform mayors who are doing a great job, but they come and go, including in this town. But just talk a little about the school boards and their role and whether their opposition to the kind of changes that you wanted to bring about was a principal factor in the fights that you fought, and how we might go about re-envisioning their role.
So a couple things on that. Well, first of all, talk about work that inspires. Your work at PPI has really been inspirational and really a beacon. Those who are not familiar with it, check it out. On the second front, look, school boards to me are often the impediments to change. There's lots of them. They're involved in politics at a pretty petty level, and I think they really are an impediment to change. So I was a strong believer, and if you look around where big things were happening, like Menino in Boston, and Daley in Chicago, and Bloomberg in New York, and then Fenty here, and while mayors come and go, I always thought it was very interesting that even though Fenty was defeated, the next mayor appointed Kaya, who was Michelle's deputy, which says a lot about my point about how status quo has changed. And I think if we're going to see big change in K-12 education, it's going to take strong mayoral leadership, and that's the model that I favor. And I'm not saying there are some functioning school boards that do a decent job, but too often I think politics get in the way of school boards. And I guess what I would like to see in America is not just at that level, but at the state and even at the federal level, the right kind of incentives to empower school districts. Whatever people think of the shortcomings of Race to the Top, there's no question Race to the Top got a lot of things done, including, for example, helping us lift the charter cap in New York. And that was really instrumental to it. So the federal government putting its thumb on the scale to incentive, I think, can have real impact.
So picking up on Will and staring at Nina, charter schools, the mayor should be in charge of the system, but should the mayor also be in charge of the charter schools in the same city?
Look, in most places, my guess is you're better off having independently authorizing charter schools. In New York, it wouldn't have mattered. If I didn't give them space, you'd have virtually no charter schools. And one of the big things we did in New York was to do something that most people don't volunteer to do, which is gave away market share by saying the traditional public schools would share with parents who wanted to go to charters. But in most cities, I think traditional superintendents are not likely to authorize, so I would support an independent
authorizing
Is
body.
that right, Nina?
Good answer. Is that right, Nina?
Not the only answer, but it's one.
Time for a couple more?
Yeah.
Richard Collenberg with the Century Foundation. So one of the things you haven't talked about is school segregation. If we want people, middle-class people, to care about other people's children, one way to do that is if they're in a school together. A good way to attract strong teachers and connect them to poor kids is if there are not high concentrations of poverty. The Appleseed Foundation found that in New York City, now about half of the community school districts are economically mixed such that they could produce greater levels of integration. And I applaud the idea of more school choice, but what about harnessing that school choice to try to bring about greater levels of integration? This is something, by the way, that Michelle Rhee and Diane Ravitch agree on. Maybe the only thing.
Look, I think it's a good goal. I think it's pretty hard to make it happen in a real-world situation, meaning you can always strive for much, much more integration. But when I took over the New York City Public Schools, Rick, it was 72% African-American and Latino. So that means your base number would be a 70-30 school. And one thing I learned from Boston and a whole lot of other places that I've been involved in is that's not going to work, that you can't balance schools that way. So what you're saying then is the experiment we did in places like St. Louis and other places where we tried to bus people really was basically saying in minority communities, your kids will be bused to other communities. Because when you started to bus people from middle-class communities, they exited the system. So my own view was we should try and create as much integration as possible. But in the end, in a school system that was 3/4 or close to 3/4 minority and had 75 or 80% free and reduced lunch, what I wanted to focus on was a good school in every community. And that became at least my priority, and I think a more sensible priority. Not that I wouldn't in any way possible want to support much more integration. And if I had a school system like Charlotte-Mecklenburg, where it's very different, it might have looked different. But I just didn't think New York, if we prioritized that, we would gain much. And in fact, the experience with the city had been that by creating these EdOp and other programs, we were basically keeping the middle-class whites in there because there was a lot of ways for them to exit the system if they felt they had to travel too much or were being put in schools for forced integration. So I think it's a tricky issue. There's nothing wrong with it. And residential, you may be right that school districts in the report, but most school districts in New York, when you get down to the neighborhood school, are not communities that are integrated. And that's always going to have an impact.
And you didn't want to annex Westchester and Bergen County and Suffolk County.
Not only didn't I want to, I was constitutionally incapable. After the Milken case, the Supreme Court made that impossible. But it's also, it seemed to me the history of desegregation has often been busing of minority children. And that just seemed to me, again, to create its own set of problems.
I think there's a question up front here. Oh, sorry. We'll get you next.
All right.
Yeah, hi.
I'm not going to do this. You do this.
Okay.
Christina Culver with EdNexus Advisors and another 20-plus year warrior in ed reform and transformation, as we're trying to call it now. Agree with what Charlie's saying, and I have a question for you. So can you talk a little bit about your vision for scalability? I mean, there's so much out there that we know that works. Other countries know it. Amanda Ripley goes around evangelizing all the time about what works in other countries. But what about sort of, using examples, say Success Academies has built 32 schools in 8 years, and you're working now for Amplify technology companies that have great products, but getting them into schools and hands of kids. What does that look like, and sort of what is your thinking about what needs to happen?
So I think the big levers on this thing are the growth in charters. I mean, it's going too slowly for people like me, but it's going a lot more quickly than people would have thought. And what we're beginning to see when we see 5-7% of the people in charter schools, those numbers will expand. And those organizations like KIPP now that have 150 schools, I think their ability to expand even more rapidly will grow. So I think that's one wing to this. Second of all, I'm confident, I may be wrong, but I'm pretty confident that this teacher professionalization thing, the story in the Post that Robert asked me about before, is really powerful, and I think we may see movement there. You know, I've been calling for the longest time for a real rethink on how we recruit, teach, all the stuff that Amanda wrote about, and you know, it sort of encapsulated the notion of a Flexner report for public education and training of teachers. And then the third thing you mentioned, which is absolutely true, is that technology, if it focuses on teaching and learning, helping teachers do their work more effectively, getting them more empowered, getting kids more engaged, can, I think, be a real stimulus. So I think those are the levers that will, those three are the key levers that will help us scale.
Right here in the front. Up there you go.
Hi, my name is Sara Lee. I am a humble teacher from Arlington Public Schools. I just read a phenomenal book by Mark Tucker called Surpassing Shanghai. And he talks about the recent PISA results and how the U.S. is doing. And unfortunately, we're average in math, reading, and science. So how do we, I feel like a lot of people talk about the achievement gap between, you know, minorities and whites. But how do we really close the achievement gap globally? And I think that the New York Times recently, maybe not recently, had an article about how if we were to compare Connecticut and Massachusetts to some of the different countries, that they're sort of on par or competitive, and but not all of the states are like that. And I think that the Common Core really helps bring that sort of coherence and national standardization.
So the question, sharpen
So
the question.
the question is, how do we incentivize teachers to invest in math and science education? And because the U.S. doesn't have the system coherence like other smaller countries like Finland and Canada, so how do we create awareness?
So I would just, not to repeat myself, but I'd say two critical things. One, in terms of professionalizing teaching. When you read Amanda Ripley's book, which sort of tees off on some of the same issues that you're talking about, what you see is in places like Finland, Japan, Korea, you see very, very different where they recruit teachers, the way they train them, and so on. And second of all, and Robert's been beating on his drum for the longest time, curriculum matters. And one of my self-criticisms in the book is I didn't get this early enough. But we don't have, it's not just Common Core standards, but really rigorous, demanding curriculum. Too much time is spent in schools on what I call self-referential learning. What do you think about? What do you feel about? And mastering knowledge and doing higher sequence thinking and so forth really matters. So those two things, I think, are critical. And we've got to stop kidding ourselves. The one thing about dumbed down standards, it makes people feel good. But in the long term, it's hurting our children.
I think it's about out of time.
I'd take one more.
Okay.
Got one hand up. We shouldn't
Yes,
deny it.
Talk a lot about the teaching profession. I haven't read Amanda's
Sure.
book. Anna Thompson, formerly of the Schwab Foundation, now Barbara Hill Advisors. I haven't read Amanda's book. I have read Checker. Per pupil spending's tripled in the last 50 years. Number of teachers have tripled. Where are you going to get the money to develop a profession that can actually reward teachers? It really boils down to the class size issue, I think. But can you talk about the structural changes that are needed so you can have sustainable merit-based pay and competitive salaries? Because it's not just about teacher prep. It's attracting people to the profession, I think. So
It is, but I think part of it is we've got to move away from lockstep pay for paying people for credentials, for paying people for 30 credits. There's a lot of money in the system that we could free up and start to use for performance-based pay and other things. Second of all, so much of it is backloaded right now. And I think if we start to think about, when you're talking about people in New York after 25 years can retire with a lifetime pension. And if we think about making pensions much more portable, enabling teachers to move in and out of the system, I think that'll have a lot of value. And finally, what I really believe is if we professionalize and the non-monetary aspects make the job more attractive in places that Amanda writes about, that's part of what the equation is. That'll attract people who will stay in the system in a rational way. This constant loss of people in the early years is what's really, it's a massive human capital waste, and we're getting hurt by it. So these are not easy. If I had easy answers, I would give them to you, but they're not easy.
what about class size rules?
The rules themselves never made any sense to me. I mean, you know, I say in the book, I don't, everybody favors lower class size, all other things being equal, but things are not always equal. And I've never met a parent who said they wouldn't rather have their kid in a class of 28 with a great teacher than a class of 20 with a crummy teacher. It never happened.
Nina, and then I,
One more
and then I've got one more for him.
Okay.
Anyway.
Nina Reese with the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. Quick question on the federal role in education with the Republican
Talk about
Congress.
making news.
No, for me this is no
What are
news.
the three things they can do at the federal level, and your advice to the next presidential candidates?
Well, I don't know. Presidential candidates, I don't give advice.
What can the feds do to help?
Well, I think, first of all, I think there is an important role for the federal government. I know that's sort of out of vogue these days, but I actually believe it. And I think you can do things through incentives, and I think the model of Race to the Top has real value. The things that I would focus on is incentivizing school choice, creating incentives for pre-K, which I think we're wasting a lot in. And now I would tie this to accountability, and I would create innovation funds that stimulate. And one of the things I write about in the book that had real impact was taking real money and saying to schools now, come up with new models. So the School of One was born in New York, P-Tech was born in New York, the iSchool was born in New York, Game School was born in New York, because we incentivize it. And I think the federal government could do a lot of those kinds of things. But don't leave it up to me. I mean, I was the one early on who said we should have a national curriculum or national standards. And then Checker reminded me that it was Bennett who said, we'll never have national standards. The Republicans don't do national, the Democrats don't do standards. So, but I'm still undeterred, and I'm still for it. We're one nation. We should have a standard of what it means to be. It shouldn't control curriculum or anything like that, but we should have a standard of what it means to be an educated American. I don't get the idea that people in different states are somehow competing with each other rather than competing in a global economy.
I got to push once more on curriculum, because you do a kind of large mea culpa in the book about not getting on to knowledge-based curriculum early enough. But should a city like New York, with 700 elementary and middle schools, have a citywide curriculum that all the teachers use, or should it not?
So I could argue this one around the flat. So I see the value, and over time what I did is let schools that were performing well develop their own curriculum. But I guess I think that a city like New York that goes to my view of standards should well and justifiably adopt a uniform curriculum of what it means to be an educated American. And I see the problems with that. But on the other hand, I don't think curriculum should be a jump ball.
Should be a jump ball. Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.